systems shape our perception of reality and thus our reality. And so it's valuable to understand the benefits, the qualities, the limitations, and problems of systems. So the first thing to understand is that reality is an undifferentiated, multidimensional sphere as a metaphor, meaning all of reality, which is far bigger, far vaster, far more multidimensional than we can perceive, and certainly that we do perceive, is interconnected. It's on a gradient scale. You can look at the color wheel, and out of the color wheel you can emphasize red, and you can take a spectrum of red, and you can divide that spectrum in thirds, you can divide it in fourths, you can divide it in tenths, in millionths. It can go on endlessly. All you can say is that there is an infinite continuum of all things, in this case red, that one can slice up in different pieces. One can name different ways. One can slice in big pieces or small pieces. But however you slice red does not capture the entirety of that little continuum, let alone the reality. Another interesting kind of face of our interface with reality is the connection between observing and measuring devices. Meaning we observe reality, and quantum physicists explain to us that there are no observers, there's only participants, but we observe reality through the lens of our observing and measuring devices. Now, as we tune and change those devices, reality shifts. If you take away sight, then color ceases to be a known and measured face of reality. Now, this is understood to go one way. You take away a person's eyes, they can no longer see reality. But we presume, because other people see reality, that what is to be seen still exists. You take away sound and you take away ears and you can no longer hear reality, but because other people have ears, we presume that sound still exists. We take away the nose and can no longer smell reality, perceive reality through the sense and measuring device of a nose, but we presume that smell still exists. Why? Because there are other people who can communicate in some way, not through sound if you've taken away ears, but in some way, that reality does contain the dimension of sound, you just don't have the ears to hear it. Now, if we take away every sense perception, reality, for all intensive purposes, ceases to exist at all. For every observing and measuring device we add and view reality through, reality appears to become more multidimensional. And this leads us to the question of what observing and measuring devices could reveal a face of reality that we don't have, because we're down to 5. And is reality really that small? Or could it be that if we added 1,000 observing and measuring devices that observed and measured things that our observing and measuring devices don't observe and measure, that reality would mushroom into a multidimensional experience that was so big that our human consciousness could not track the synesthetic input from so many observing and measuring devices, observing and measuring so many things, such that even though reality is far vaster than our primary senses observe, we would prefer to limit our experience of all that is to the little bit that gets through our observing and measuring devices in a way that does not overwhelm the processing power of our memory and language organized thought process that reconstructs reality in our mind in the same way that the brain reconstructs light inside to reconfigure a map of reality that is not actually reality. Because that leads us into the next part, or the next face of a system, which is that all systems are metaphors of an underlying complexity that cannot be captured fully within the paradigm or framework of the system. It's much like Google Maps, which cannot process every pine needle on every tree it passes, but it can process the names of the streets and rough lines that give us a version of reality expressed in street names and curvaceous or straight shapes. So Google Maps is not the landscape. It isn't even a tenth of a tenth of a tenth of the landscape. It isn't even a millionth of the landscape. Google Map doesn't show color variations. Google Maps doesn't count pine needles. Google Maps doesn't capture the smell of one street versus another. It's a crude map, adequate to get us where we want to go. And whether it's a Google map or a thought map, a list of ideas, all maps, all systems are maps. All maps are a crude approximation of reality that focus on the things that we give significance to. Now, our primary map for navigating reality is language, because our primary map of understanding and being conscious of reality is thought. And it is impossible to think a thought without language, which means that the map of language, the map of reality, which is chopped and differentiated through words. You take the unending sensory experience of reality and you break it up into pieces called words. And then you relate not to reality as much as you relate to the pieces revealed in thought of reality, resting on language. When I say finger, I take this mass, which is an integrated ecology, and break it into 5 by defining a finger as a point on the hand and defining the hand as a flat space at the end of an articulating shape. But every one of those things is built upon one another. It's built on a letter structure. It's built on a sound structure. It's built on images that are perceived to be distinct from one another in a reality that is interconnected. Every system creates artificial separation, obscures multidimensional interconnection. Every system divides the whole, the sphere, into a series of distinctions that, in doing so, creates pain. The existential pain, in this case, of the human ego being divided through language into a separate, distinct form, longing for the experience of unity, of wholeness, of oneness that it had before it was broken out of the herd, cut out of the landscape, separated from the ancestry, shaped by the cult, and recreated as a distinct individual, 2 words that only make sense when viewing a small portion of reality through a series of lenses and suppositions that lead to an idea that in order to know the world, we must first break it into parts and name them. Every system leaves a remainder, a shadow, an outlaw. If we look at this shape of the cube, it is a map of the underlying reality that has 6 faces. Now, it is a paradigm, and when we look at reality through those 6 faces, we can hold 6 distinctions, 6 distinct faces. But the spherical, multidimensional, infinite color spectrum reality that is behind the cube is obscured. And although within the volume of the cube there is a good chunk of reality contained that can be examined through the paradigm of the cube, there's what's called a remainder. It's the bit of reality that doesn't fit into the box. It doesn't fit into the paradigm. It doesn't fit into the language. It has no name. It's on the outside. But simply because we have imposed a cube onto the multidimensional whole that is the infinite one, the sphere, does not separate the landscape, the energy pattern that's over here from the energy pattern that's in here. Language separates it in the mind, which means that within the mind there is friction between the underlying reality and the paradigm that's used to view reality. That remainder, that shadow, that which is denied and suppressed to support and reinforce the paradigm, becomes an outlaw, becomes an outcast. And all energy that is outcast seeks to undermine the system that suppresses and denies it, so as to facilitate the return to wholeness, the healing of the wound that is imposed through the creation of language. All systems create human consciousness by framing thought through the distinctions used to articulate the system. Every system creates the perception of order, meaning purpose, through the structure that is imposed on the underlying ecology with infinite possibilities, meaning the sphere is an infinite number of refracted straight lines and an infinite number of dots and particles. A computer can generate the color wheel in 256 million separate distinct colors, limited to the processing power of the chip in the computer, not how small the particles of color on an endless wave can be broken down. Every system is a flawed map of the underlying field or reality it seeks to represent. And systems have a couple of different distinctions that are worth noting. One is the continuum between symmetry and imbalance. And so within the primal geometries, a sphere, a triangle, etc., you have a fair amount of symmetry. The other continuum is complexity and simplicity. If you take reality as a whole, a sphere, and cut it in half, and polarize it with this is good and this is bad, you have a violent journey traversing the road with half a wheel. When you divide reality into a million different dots and symmetrically distribute them to form a wheel, or as in the case of a bicycle, maybe 32 spokes or 52 spokes, you distribute the weight in a circle, you have grace. The most graceful systems have high complexity, distinction, awareness, symmetry, beauty, and facilitate in the return to oneness, the return to the circle and the sphere, the most efficient shape, the most efficient metaphor for transporting large volumes of energy from one place to another, be it the propeller of a jet engine, the circular shape of a rocket flare, the shape of a bicycle, a truck, the paddle of a boat. It is the return to the circle, the return to the sphere that facilitates grace, graceful transmutation, transformation, transportation of one energy to another more than anything else. As a system moves towards complexity and grace, when is destruction an essential part of recreation and new life? Well, a triangular system can break down, a system of three can break down into infinitely smaller degrees of 3 and infinitely bigger degrees of 3 in a fractal or holographic pattern. But when going from a 3-point number system to a 4-point number system, when going from a 10-point number system to a 12-point number system, one must regroup entirely and start dividing the underlying reality using a completely different metric of measurement. In doing so, as a system moves from a 3-point number system to a 24-point number system or a 12-point number system, one must first destroy the symbols used to create the triangular map of reality in order to replace it with a more complex and gradually more balanced and symmetrical version of that complexity on the journey to grace.